It's just a phase. Who among us hasn't heard this about our pagan beliefs from a friend or family member? They might be well-meaning or judgmental, but regardless of their motivations, the fact remains that our traditions tend to be associated with teenagers going through a goth phase, and often aren't treated like the life commitments we hope they'll be. Which is why it can be so hard to bring up the challenges we face when trying to keep our traditions in our own lives in the long haul. So, let's talk about them. Kairete. Being a pagan long-term is fraught with a lot more challenges than many of us want to believe when we first feel the heady rush of a divine experience or dive deep into the weeds of research and practice building. I and other creators and community admins and mods have noticed a disturbing trend among pagans generally, which include friends of mine who run long-term IRL communities, which is that something close to half the pagans who make it to the 5-year mark drop off around that time, either jumping traditions or leaving paganism entirely. I did interviews in my community and several allied spaces to try and get to the bottom of this phenomenon, and the results surprised me in some places. Keep in mind that I talked to over 50 people who either tradition hopped at or around the 5-year mark or made it past, about the struggles that they faced and the support they wished they'd had, and their reasons for staying or for tradition hopping. As always, these experiences won't apply perfectly to everyone, and I promised everybody who spoke with me anonymity, so I'm not going to be using specific examples, but I do think that there are some cultural things the majority of pagans experience together that can be helpful to de-elephant in the room, as it were. So I'm going to be drawing correlations in aggregate from the various interviews that I did. This video will be divided into 3 main parts, though each of them will cover a number of subtopics as well. The first will be on the life cycle of the typical first-generation pagan convert, and some advice for each of the stages leading up to the long haul at stage 3. The second is on the 5-year wall phenomenon itself, and some of the prevalent causes that I was given by members of the community, as well as suggested solutions for some of them. I'm not going to promise I can solve every problem by myself, that's a tall order. Finally, the last section will be on consistency in worship and dealing with common neurodivergent hurdles, as well as finding motivation on bad days and how you can build recognition of your relationship with the gods into your altar itself through votive offerings. This video is primarily opinion-based, and as such, I might say some things you disagree with. That's fine. I don't have solutions for every problem I'm going to bring up, but I do think as a community we need to do a better job of addressing these problems that long-term pagans can face, and my hope is that this can be a discussion starter in the community as a whole. With that, Part 1. The life cycle of the pagan convert. I've noticed that for more revivalist traditions at least, many pagans go through 3 semi-distinct phases in their practice over the first 5 years or so. Keep in mind, all of these get combined and shift depending on what subtopic you might be incorporating into your theology or practice, and that your individual personality and predilections might affect how these stages interact with each other in your life, but in terms of creating a model to discuss these things on a broader level, these 3 stages seem to do the trick. I covered some of the major mistakes made in the first 2 phases in my video on beginning pagan mistakes. Check that out in the iCard if you missed it. So I'm only going to discuss them in broad strokes here. The first stage is the conversion or research phase, and it can be the most exciting for a lot of people as everything feels fresh and new, though some folks do find it a bit overwhelming in Hellenism because there's a lot of ground to cover. This is the phase where you've decided you're going to try a more revivalist approach and begin poring over blogs and videos and books and monographs and scholarly articles, anything you can get your hands on that might give you a good overview of the basics. This isn't to say that research isn't a part of the later phases ever, but more that in the early days, many people opt to spend a longer period researching the basics and deciding how their practice will go before they dip their toes into worship. My advice for those in the research phase right now is that you probably don't need as much information as you think you do to get started. A baseline knowledge of prayer and ritual structure, basic cleansing practices, and some basic offerings like red wine and frankincense for Hellenists will typically get you pretty far to begin with. It's really easy to get caught up in trying to know know everything rather than engaging directly with the gods, and sometimes latent Christianity can creep in and overwhelm you with anxiety when you think you're ready, so you change your mind and head back to the books. Remember, the gods engage with us primarily through our praxis with them and parts of our daily lives where their domains fall, so getting the base level of knowledge you need to start and figuring out the rest as you go is a perfectly valid approach. Also, at least in Hellenism, there's a really short list of things that anger the gods. Messing up ritual likely isn't one of them. The worst that could happen is not getting the warm glow that tells you your offerings have been accepted, and unless you do something really off, like trying to offer your own blood or someone else's, don't do that. I'm working on a whole series on why that's a bad idea, and the first video is up in the iCard. I do briefly want to talk about another set of emotions that can interfere with the transition to the second phase, and that's grappling with fears related to the conversion itself, usually the fear of being wrong. This can manifest as a fear of hell for folks who are still struggling with converting from Christianity, as the majority of us do, or grappling with accepting the existence of the divine if you're coming from atheism or agnosticism, but can also manifest as guilt for leaving behind prior reciprocity for tradition hoppers. Regardless, elongating the research phase can feel like a safe haven, as one isn't truly committed until one steps before the altar and calls out to the gods with offerings for the first time. The advice for getting through this varies on which of these feels you're dealing with. I have a whole video on latent Christianity, links in the iCard if you missed it. The fear of hell does subside most often with practice and the development of discernment with divine experiences, though sometimes researching the history of the development of the concept can help. I've done a couple of videos on the idea of where hell came from as well, and learning all about the influences that went into it may help you ease your way out of those fears. Those videos are on my Christians Are Weird playlist, and you can find that on the front of my channel after you finish this video if you want to. In terms of the struggles that former atheists and agnostics deal with, well, culture often reinforces those ideas, so that can be a real hurdle. Remember that belief in the divine is not incompatible with science and technology. Science is a methodology that can get us certain kinds of answers. It doesn't deal with unfalsifiable ideas like free will or the existence of the gods who have said free will. You can pray for help with healing and go to the doctor. It's not a binary. You're not suddenly less rational because you pray and offer, despite what edgy anti-theists might tell you. As for tradition hoppers, well, remember you always have the option to honor prior gods in the new way, or in your old way if you so choose. You don't have to practice the tradition of the gods that you also feel called to now in the way the ancients did it, or its modern equivalent, if you don't feel you need to. Syncretism is the most pagan thing there is. You don't have to abandon an old tradition just because you feel called to another pantheon. You can do both. It's one of the beautiful things about being pagan. The second phase is the praxis building phase, which often continues with research but is marked by a major shift in focus from thinking about your praxis to actually doing it, and sometimes keeping track of the results depending on how data-minded you are. Be it feelings after leaving the temple, or divine experiences, or trying out new ways of cleansing or new offerings, what have you. This can be a tenuous time for many people, as you're still finding your feet, as it were, building the rhythms and ritual and prayer that will carry you in the long haul and last you for most of the rest of your life. Some luckier folks have communities that do public ritual as well to help them to get their feet wet earlier, and some people will jump in head first into practice without doing a ton of research to begin with. But most find that the praxis building phase is the longest of the three in the first 5 years. My advice to those in the praxis building phase is simple. It takes time to get comfortable with ritual and prayer structure, but that time only works in your favor if you're practicing regularly. Remember that rituals don't have to be incredibly long recitations of Homeric hymns to be valid, and if you learn the basic prayer structure, ad-libbing prayers in said structure gets easier with time, and so does the rhythm of offering and the reflexes needed to do things like pouring libations straight from the bottle without making a mess. You get the most out of this phase by practicing regularly and prioritizing your practice each day when you can. This is how you start and maintain your goddess with the gods, and the more regular you are in this phase, the easier transition to the long haul will be. Phase 3 is the long haul, i.e. the rest of your life. This is where people's expectations tend to collide with reality a bit. A lot of revivalist pagans came from Wicca, and Wiccans often run into a wall themselves where they look for advanced Wicca and end up studying ceremonial magic or other occult traditions, looking for more complex techniques, tools, etc., rather than deepening their practice by really grounding themselves in the fundamentals. This often manifests for revivalists as trying to make the long haul look like the previous 2 phases, where they feel like they need their practice to become more complex, or they need to be researching forever into more and more granular topics. I mean, there's nothing wrong with wanting to learn more on the surface, but this can easily turn into looking for the gods in books instead of everyday life. Unfortunately, sometimes when the excitement dies, people crave finding it again and tradition hop because they mistake this settling down for disconnection from the gods. Our community attracts a lot of neurodivergent people, and sometimes that can be a factor in this as well. It's easy to practice regularly when you're getting the dopamine rush of new information and skills all the time, but when things get more routine, there's an urge to go looking for that rush again instead of maintaining what you built and all the work you've already done. The truth is, it's normal not to experience the high of new knowledge and competence all the time as you get into the long-haul stages of your practice. In fact, it's typical and expected for worship to become a regular part of everyday life, and for religion to not necessarily be as big of a focus as you settle into the rhythms that will last you the rest of your life. The knowledge you acquire from the previous two phases becomes a part of your mindset rather than an active focus, internalizing a pagan worldview that then just becomes a part of how you think. You might notice Demeter's hand in the grains you cook for dinner, or Hestia's glow in the candles at the center of your holiday table at a gathering with family, or the laughter of the Kairetes at a summer barbecue. The excitement and newness dies, but it's replaced by a more steady confidence over time, sturdied by the goddess that you've built leading up until now. Remember, though, that if you were born into a polytheistic culture, you wouldn't really have that research and conversion rush unless you shifted traditions at some point in your life anyway. Instead, this longer-term maintenance would just be your norm. It's actually kind of the point of all the work in that first place, to build a framework that will let us maintain the relationships with these incredible beings who called us to their service, or who our fascination with drew us to want to honor, as not everyone feels called. Which reminds me, there's a set of challenges I don't feel qualified to cover here related to raising pagan kids and decisions surrounding that. I'm not a parent, so I don't feel comfortable giving advice on an area of life I've never experienced myself. I'm not gonna be one of those childless people who seems to think that they could do it better than everyone else. I'm staying out of this one. The shift in focus, though, that I was just talking about also requires acquiring a new skill set. One which you could develop during the research and praxis building phase, but typically really comes into focus as a necessity during the long haul phase, without which many people don't get past Part 2, the 5-year wall. It's an uncomfortable truth that in the long haul, being a pagan can feel like an obstacle course, with numerous hurdles from unmet expectations to a lack of skill needed to integrate practice and support the shift into the last phase of pagan conversion, to drama, to any number of other issues. I don't have solutions for every one of these hurdles, but just knowing they're there can allow you to prepare for them more so you don't get blindsided in your journey. We lose about half of the pagans that make it to the 5-year mark, either to tradition hopping or leaving paganism entirely. This is a concept I've seen thrown around as the 5-year pagan half-life, the tradition hopping period, the pagan disappearing act, the dropout period, etc. But when I first noticed it in my community, I gave it the name the 5-year wall, and that's what we'll be calling it in this video. The only people I've seen talking about it are community leaders in group chats, usually in hushed tones because it's frankly depressing and often makes folks uncomfortable that have seen the pattern of pagan disappearance around the 4 to 6 year mark. In fact, people often don't like talking about the disappearances because it seems like a tacit acknowledgement of the oft-slung accusation of paganism being a phase for some people, when in reality, the circumstances that caused the drop-off around the 5-year mark are complex. I did a survey across 4 servers to test my theories on the reason behind the 5-year wall and came away with some surprising findings. We'll start with the most obvious hurdles first because we want to get you through the obstacle course, and knowledge is power. People are often the most active during the research and praxis phase when things are new and exciting, but as people settle into the long haul phase, there are a number of obstacles that people just aren't equipped to deal with because only about half of us make it over the wall. Of that, one of the first hurdles we have is the community itself, or the lack of roles beyond teaching newcomers and established pagan communities for people in the long haul phase. Many people come to the community looking for guidance on practice, help with research, etc., but because our communities are often averse to anything that looks like Christianity and thereby lack any kind of structure beyond occasional public rites, either online or IRL depending on the community. Short of attending if the community in question actually does them, there's not much more an experienced pagan can do in a group other than help teach new pagans if they're asked. Searching for a role, many people who do stay after the 5-year mark either become solitary or family practitioners, or they create communities of their own and teach, either due to disagreements with the leadership of the one they were in, or because they were looking to have a more well-defined role in a community. This can be one of the sources for the build the temple drive, which isn't necessarily a bad thing isolated from other factors, but when we look at the demographics of folks who tend to become pagan, we find that it's typically, we're not exactly well off enough to just buy land and build one. And even if someone was, there are all kinds of risks associated with that, both for the temple builder and manager or the community visiting. I don't think we should give up on the dream to have temples in the modern day at some point, but I do think logistically one person just getting land and setting one up can be fraught with problems. Not the least of which that even if a nonprofit is established to manage the temple, if the rights to the land are still in the hands of an individual, that individual has a lot of power over the decisions of the nonprofit. It's an entire digression of its own, however, and I got into it in more detail on my videos on the wisdom of Odin. Sometimes this desire to find a place in the community can make folks vulnerable to some pretty messed up attitudes and behaviors on the part of community leaders online. My good friend, Fel the Blythe, is here to tell you all about what happens when someone is gradually acclimated to these toxic attitudes and eased into perpetuating them themselves. Take it away, Fel.
Thanks for having me, Aliakai. So much of historical paganism is communal. While of course it can be practiced solitarily, the simple fact of the matter is that certain aspects are missed without a community. Just as someone getting into a hobby or a show, it's human nature to eventually wind up looking for a community. We look for a community for a number of reasons: a shared interest, communal learning, support, shared experiences, or even simply curiosity. Communities can be wonderful things. They can be beautiful. I personally left the pagan community in 2015 and I didn't rejoin until 2020. Of course, I have my issues today, which we'll touch a little bit, but the fact of the matter is that I'm still here for a reason. I still think that communities are worth it. I mean, I've been a part of moving group rituals. I have seen the pure power of a group of people a part of the same tradition, the unbridled love and joy. As I said in an older video of mine, community is the point. But what happens when we try to find acceptance and we end up finding indoctrination instead? There are hundreds of different pagan discords. I mean, there are lots of eclectic in-person groups. Of course, there's nowhere near as, say, mainstream Christianity. One of the main differences, besides the obvious spiritual difference between paganism and Christianity, is our decentralization. I mean, by its definition, paganism is an umbrella term. How many times do we find ourselves sharing a space with traditions we aren't even a part of? And even amongst our own traditions, there are many of us who define that path differently from the next. We tend to practice heterodoxy and heteropraxy, different belief, different practice, which is a whole other conversation for another day. But since paganism is so decentralized, these communities can very often pop up or are created by a small group of leaders, whether that's content creators, a small group of like-minded individuals, friends, and it tends to be more difficult for groups to form in person because there's just simply not enough of us in one space. And the groups that did exist, sadly, most of them have disappeared during the pandemic. For better or for worse, we live in the age of the internet, and that means that space is no longer a barrier for us. And while decentralization isn't inherently a bad thing, we are also a decentralized religion with limited modern standard for hierarchy and group structure, meaning that when a group forms, there's no precedent for good checks and balances. We have to make those ourselves. And oftentimes when a group forms, many of us don't necessarily have experience in forming groups. So those checks and balances, what makes healthy leadership, is not at the forefront of our mind, or we automatically assume that everyone will go by an honor system. Spoiler alert, that doesn't work. And so then, like, these groups that do come together are hardly a random organization of strangers. Rather, it's one or two content creators. It's a group of friends. I mean, I've been there wanting to form a group with people that I love. However, while that can be a beautiful thing, a group run by friends or a group run by content creators can also be prone to nepotism. Surprise, nepotisms, not just for the rich and famous. It can also be exhibited by a mod team. Groups that crop up around content creators are even more difficult to build in checks and balances, because if everyone who joins is a fan, then off the bat, you have an unbalanced system. This is not to say it's not impossible to have a healthy group dynamic. However, that group will always begin and end with that creator. Now, of course, not all these groups break bad. Checks and balances like voting or open forums, sharing power of leadership, or leaders that answer to other bodies of power and are actually held responsible, this can help mitigate the risk. However, when they do break bad, it's often a very slow fade. So one day you might wake up and realize that this has happened to you, or you find yourself having become a part of this mob. And it can be very difficult to see a group is toxic when you're in it, because toxicity is something that is slow and happens over time and not all at once. You start accepting aspects of it and then suddenly you find yourself accepting it all. This can look like a slow trend towards orthodoxy, right belief, which can evolve into dogmatism. This sounds like you can't be in this community and believe that. You're not allowed to question. You're not allowed to read that. If you cannot question the leaders of a community without getting banned or kicked out, or if the leader claims to have behind the scenes knowledge and you should just trust them, that is when they start to become a cult. Oftentimes the shift doesn't happen on purpose, which makes matters worse for us. Well-meaning folks can unintentionally perpetuate the hive mind. People don't do things for no reason. They genuinely believe that what they are doing is good. I mean, just because a group claims to support free thinking doesn't mean they do in practice. They might even truly believe that they do. However, oftentimes their say one thing while actually using subtle tactics to enforce a particular mindset. To learn more about those tactics and how they can affect every single one of us, please check out my video, which is a partner to this one. So when people do wisen up or get sick of the drama, they either get kicked out or they storm off. I mean, this was the main reason I personally left the pagan community many years ago. The community I was in was giving me more anxiety and stress than it was helping me. I had just left a fundamentalist cult and I did not want to end up in another. And I knew that it was unfortunately very common for people like me to end up in another group without meaning to. I didn't rejoin the spiritual community again until 5 years later, when the pandemic loneliness kind of caused me to consider giving it another shot. The irony of all of this is that the pagan community is so adverse to structure and hierarchical leadership. And what's ironic about it is we're so adverse to it that we somehow end up forming communities around strong personalities, people who decide to talk on the internet. Hi, because we're not an organization. Instead of actually working on a structure that could benefit so many of us. And if these personalities give up or end up not being who you thought they were, then the community crumbles. Traditional groups, on the other hand, are built to outlast their creators. And even if there are leadership missteps, you can elect new leaders and put in new laws. The drama doesn't just drive out those it involves, it can scare away more drama-adverse people. I mean, I have met many solitary pagans in my life who have decided to leave the community altogether after witnessing or being a part of a group that crumbles, or even just knowing about it. I mean, our reputation, unfortunately, precedes us in that regard. And it also scares away potential community leaders or thinkers, people who want to take a step beyond 101. It holds us back. I mean, I'm a moderator in a couple servers, and I have witnessed hundreds of people leaving, citing drama as the primary reason, whether or not that drama is even happening in that server. But not only does the drama scare away people, for those of us who've decided to stick with it can accidentally get caught in a toxic cycle. Because when someone leaves a toxic group without proper deconstruction, they can end up taking those toxic traits with them and either inadvertently contributing to another toxic culture or getting kicked out of more stable groups for those behaviors, ending up being more centralized and isolated. I've seen and been in communities both online and in person that have collapsed. And for many people, it's never short of devastating. It can induce very real grief in all of its stages. It's not a simple, oh well, for many folks. It can be like losing everything. Besides grief, other side effects of this collapse could be self-blame. How could I have been so stupid to join this group? Lack of trust. What if I'm not safe in this group? Or even paranoia, projecting toxic traits onto other groups that aren't actually toxic. Or even fully leaving a tradition. And that last one happened to me. Twice. Community is essential and it can be done right. The reason I focus so heavily on these groups and how they develop is because every community always has the capability to do better. In fact, openness to criticism is the hallmark of a healthy group. They don't have to agree with you, but how they handle the criticism speaks volumes. Do they gaslight you? Do they love bomb you? Do they not so subtly influence other people to harass you? Do they pull you into a ticket to berate you? Do they publicly shame you? Or do they thank you for your time, listen to your criticisms, have a discussion with you, bring it up to the larger community at whole? It's also important to recognize that none of us are immune to propaganda. I'm not immune to propaganda. All of us have the capacity to be manipulated by these tactics and unintentionally inflict these on other people. Self-awareness is important so we don't enable or end up in toxic communities. If you want to know more about the life cycle of a toxic community, what it's like to be in one when it develops, and how we in our community can deal with toxicity and be better, check out the video over on my channel. And be sure to look for Aliakai Spot, all about dehumanization and how not only does it affect us as content creators, but it also affects you in your communities. So with that, back to you.
Thank you so much, Vel. We lose so many folks to cults and cultish abusive behavior, and as wary of it as we are, the unrealistic way it's portrayed when it's discussed can really become a barrier to recognizing the toxicity as it develops in communities. If you want to get deeper into that process by which a group can become a cult, check out Vel's video. She has a lot of insight and experience that I just don't regarding that topic, and we work on these videos together in the hope that the conversations we start could encourage positive change. Community is essential after all. We go looking for it for a reason, and there are healthy ways communities can engage with each other and meet the needs of their members. The next major hurdle we face on our obstacle course is outside pressure from culture, family members, friends, etc. I can't get too deep into dealing with friends and family because every case is different. In fact, this is one of the major places where a community you trust enough to share your circumstances when dealing with these obstacles can be a major boon. On the cultural side, however, the majority of pagans find themselves in cultures that are either overwhelmingly secular or overwhelmingly Christian. This chafes against the pagan worldview, which begins ripening and continues developing throughout a pagan's lifetime if they get over the wall, and can also limit dating prospects and make managing relationships with family difficult. Society perpetually gaslights pagans from their own experiences, which is why we have built online communities and, for some lucky people, IRL spaces for ourselves. But one can't speak as openly about these experiences in most places as they could say a church luncheon and shenanigans that happened there. A Christian might be able to offhandedly mention an answered prayer, but a pagan doing the same often tiptoes around which God did the answering and how they prayed out of fear of judgment. In some places in the US, for example, pagans without union protections could face discrimination and loss of employment, or even have their kids taken away by biased CPS workers under frivolous grounds that amount to anti-pagan discrimination. Being openly pagan is a real risk in many industries, which is a reminder of why we need unions, by the way. It's much harder to fire someone on frivolous grounds when an organized cadre of workers is standing at the ready to challenge the decision. It's a personal decision who to come out to, if anyone, but living at least partially closeted is often the safest decision for many of us, and it can be incredibly isolating. It's another reminder of why community is essential. It also means that finding support for and assistance in interpreting divine experiences, which are often but not always a major component of one's path, can be difficult, as there's perpetual internal doubt about the identification of said experiences in the first place. Many modern pagan ideas actively hamstring attempts by long-haul pagans to process and respond to their experiences. See my video on epiphanies and the issues I have with the use of the UPG, SPG, VPG framework in modern pagan spaces for a whole 30-plus minute discussion on that. I've got opinions. In ancient times, divine experiences were significant and either manifested as blessings or gave information through omens and epiphanies to worshippers or entire city-states. We need a framework for handling said divine experiences, as often a large part of the pagan long haul is in responding to blessings, omens, and epiphanies. It makes sense if you think about it. We spent years building codice, reciprocity, studying, refining our praxis, and when we settle into a comfortable routine, what's left is to enjoy our relationships with the gods and process any interactions we might have with them. Eventually, I'll give these ideas a more thorough look in their own video, but for now, I'd like to propose a suggested framework for processing divine experiences for Hellenists. Step 1 would be identify what sort of divine experience it could be, potentially verifying the divine nature through divination. The main types of divine experiences I tend to categorize are epiphanies, or appearances of the god through visions physically or in dreams, omens, where the gods deliver messages through coincidences or natural phenomena, and blessings, which are gifts from the gods or answered prayers. Step 2 would be if you've identified a blessing, well, thank you offerings might be in order. But if it's an omen or an epiphany, a series of questions would be needed to determine the message being given, and that would be the next step. If these can range from what the symbolism of the vision or dream or omen means to you personally, whether there's ancient symbolism that corresponds to it and how that might affect it, which god you believe communicated and how that intersects with the previous answers, and an examination of your own personal history and prior divine experiences if that's applicable. This second step is personal and variable and might be the stage where one turns to the community for aid, as others could chime in with insights. It's important to recognize that none of these questions can determine if an experience is divine or not. That's what part 1 is for, divining on whether it's a divine message and figuring out what sort by looking at its characteristics. Step 2 assumes that the answer to that question is a yes and seeks to understand it. Step 3 is the shorter of the steps, which is determining your response and/or verifying the interpretation through an appropriate divination method. Basically, deciding what you're going to do, if anything, and then double-checking all your prior work to make sure that you're not working off a misunderstanding. It might sound like a lot of work, but depending on how complex the experience is, it might not actually be as lengthy as a process as it initially sounds. If we're dealing with maintaining reciprocity in the long term, it makes sense that the gods would respond to us and that we need to feel competent enough to handle that response. Discernment, or the ability to recognize divine interaction for what it is a skill developed over time. When long-haul folks make it to the 5-year mark without developing some of these skills, the drop-off of excitement coupled with the shift in focus can sometimes cause a level of discomfort that makes people mistake this for disconnection from the gods. When the message many communities send is that the divine experiences are on some kind of tier list, depending on how well they match the existing lore or how well the lore can be bent to apply to the experience, and don't encourage members to take the next step and respond to said experiences or even figure out what they actually mean, then we do our communities a disservice by contributing to the pressure from the outside to ignore what our senses tell us about the gods. I'm not talking about mental illness here, disclaimer as always. I'm discussed the complications that can cause in the Epiphany video that I referenced earlier. I'm talking about divine experiences. Some people go their whole pagan lines without an experience that they recognize as divine beyond received blessings, and that's valid and shouldn't be looked down upon or invalidated. For many of us, though, divine experiences are often what brought us to paganism in the first place, and our fear of orthodoxy can prevent us collectively from providing the support that new and experienced pagans alike need to deal with them. This support can be one of the roles more experienced pagans could take on in the community, asking targeted questions to help folks figure out the meaning of their experiences and sharing their own perspectives. It might not seem like I'm proposing a lot of solutions here beyond the advice around divine experiences, and I know the topic of the 5-year wall and the loss of experienced members is a downer, but I think it's important to start this conversation in communities we share because I believe the solutions to many of these issues will depend on our individual communities and their specific needs. Our traditions are among the fastest growing in many modern countries, but we're not as good at providing the support for people to maintain their practices and beliefs long term, so that growth isn't always apparent. The first step is recognizing there's a problem in the first place. That said, one area I can offer more advice on is the last major issue many interviewees shared with me, that of the struggle to be consistent with one's praxis. Part 3. Consistency and Worship. Consistency. What's that again? Can you eat it? Many in the pagan community are neurodivergent, and all of us have some kind of life outside of being a pagan, and worshipping regularly can be difficult to integrate into said life. The advice I'm going to give here will apply primarily to non-closeted pagans, as I already did a whole video on closeting and advice there. My first bit of advice for anybody is to get mental health assistance for any conditions that you may have that might get in the way of consistent worship, like depression, anxiety, ADHD, etc. Learning how to cope and live with these conditions in a non-religious context will make applying the advice that follows much easier. It's important to start from a firm foundation and as stable of mental health as you can manage, so I'm going to assume that you're in the process of getting some kind of treatment and have gotten these sorts of conditions under control for the things that I say here. Next, it can be really helpful to find your bare minimum for worship for bad days. I have said this 1,000 times and I'll say it again. Not every prayer needs to be a full recitation of a Homeric hymn, and you don't even need to memorize those if you use them as offerings. Prayers can be short and simple. A short prayer in the tripartite style when you're, say, looking for a new job might be, Hermes of the markets, swift-footed messenger of the gods, he who presides over all exchange. As you've assisted so many in finding fortune and stability, help me find a job that is right for me and can support me and my family. How long did that take to say? A minute or two? If you start the incense at the beginning and pour a libation at the end, there's one prayer in your ritual. Your prayers can and should be tailored to your needs and experiences. Make a note of whose sacred day it is, who else you wish to pray to, who needs thanks for blessings, etc. before you step before the altar, as that can prevent the flailing feeling of not knowing what to do once you get there, so you can enjoy the familiar rhythm of prayer and worship. Familiarity and routine are more powerful than many of us recognize. If you get used to ad-libbing prayers in the proper style, you'll need less planning and can just allow yourself to speak freely to the gods as your prayers naturally shift into the proper rhythm. It's a beautiful feeling, but it only comes from practice. And one of the ways you can know you've hit the long haul phase is when this style of prayer feels natural and off the cuff during daily worship. Offerings, too, can be fairly simple for daily practice. You don't need to bake honey cakes every time you offer, or cut up a whole fruit salad, or whatever else you might think about. Libations of wine and burned frankincense were the workhorse offerings from ancient people, and they can be for you too. Wine or grape juice are available at most supermarkets, and frankincense is online at occult shops and even at Catholic supply stores. Just don't mention to them what you're actually buying it for. You also don't need to reproduce the entire civic calendar at home. It was a civic calendar, after all. One person cannot and should not try to provide a personal home variant of all the traditional offerings given by an entire city-state. Daily offerings are ideal, but it can be helpful to pick and choose which holidays are the most meaningful to you, or join a community and attempt group rituals rather than trying to put on the whole festival yourself at home. Ultimately, the key to consistency lies in integrating religion into your daily life in the space where it's most accessible and likely to be consistent, showing yourself and the gods that it's a priority without it having to be your life. It can be really helpful to pick a particular time of day or another habit to attach worship to in order to help you build the praxis. I tend to worship right after breakfast, for example. But what if you're struggling with motivation? My advice here requires a bit of setup and explanation, so bear with me. Divine experiences can often mark important milestones in our journeys as pagans. Many of us will accumulate a tidy sum of votive offerings, marking them and symbolizing the whole of our coddis with the gods and that of our families when we become pagan parents or have a pagan spouse of the same tradition. Votive offerings are a physical testament to the reality of the gods. They represent oaths fulfilled and blessings received. Modern pagans collect them on altars. They're a visual reminder of the reality of divine experiences close to when they happened, and can create a timeline of coddis that spans the whole of a pagan lifetime, or even the lifetime of their children if they stay in the faith. It's a major antidote to "I don't want to worship" or "I don't feel like it" when someone sees the whole of the good done for them laid out in a stunning display in the worship area. In other words, I am suggesting that incorporating votive offerings that are symbolic of major blessings and experiences into your altar setup can be incredibly helpful for beating the "I didn't feel like it" blues that some of us get on bad days. This is something that only comes about in the later stages of a pagan's practice, but can also act as a buffer against the chafing of an excessively secular Christian society as well, as the offerings show us that we felt so strongly about something that happened that we chose to commemorate it with an offering that's meant to last on our altars long term. Votives are at once deeply personal, but also communal, marking for family or community essential or defining experiences for said individuals, families, or communities. In IRL communities, if temples eventually exist, they can mark the reality of the gods on a larger scale for whole areas as they once did in ancient times. But even on a personal, solitary, or family level, they create a record of physical material of the most powerful moments of recognition and gifts given, a reassurance of the existence and relationship with these incredible beings. Votives are underappreciated and often underutilized in the pagan community, but they can become a powerful ally and an essential tool for overcoming some of the hurdles that come along in the later stages of pagan practice. Human memories are often very sensory, triggered by sight or sound or taste. And just a glance at a votive from times past can awaken all manner of emotions and memories when we most need them. These associations are why, if your grandma gave you a favorite mug and she passes, it can be so hard to process when it breaks. The memory's still there, but without the trigger, it just might not feel as intense. Votives create these records for a lifetime, and their presence on our altars reaffirms our commitments to our gods and the reality of our own experiences every time we stand at our altars, as familiar as the scent of rising incense or the precise tip of the wine glass for a libation. When we're at our deepest pits of doubt and despair, they provide us with the reassurance that we weren't alone in the past, and we're not now either. Finally, this is one tip that might be controversial, but there's truth in it, so I'll say it anyway. You also have to make the commitment to yourself and mean it that you're going to make worship a priority if you want to ensure that it actually happens. A lot of us are in the habit of making wishy-washy commitments to ourselves and others and begin to lose trust in our own words as a result. However, when something truly deeply matters to you and you resolve that come hell or high water you're getting through it, you're far more likely to make the adjustment in your life that are required to make that happen. The truth is, anytime you're doing one thing, you can't be doing something else. You might really want a game or sleep in that extra 20 minutes, but if you want to make worship a priority, you'd need to treat it like one. That means acknowledging that priority isn't a mental-only concept, it requires action. And that might include change that might be difficult or uncomfortable at first. It might take longer than you think for it to feel natural or for the urge to go and do it to well up just like brushing your teeth or eating breakfast. The effort is worth it if you want a stable and steady goddess with the gods. It's like any other relationship. You get what you put into it. Habit building is hard, and some of us never quite have to stop trying to make conscious decisions to make things done when we do them. If it's important to you, though, you can find a way. Anyhow, thank you so much for sticking through that. If you're new here, trip the subscribe button and walk the like through how to deal with divine experiences. I know this video likely felt bleak and that you might be staring up the long-term mountain with a bit of apprehension, but remember that there are in fact other pagans that made it past the 5-year mark in our communities, so it can be done. I think we need to come together to help support more folks hitting the wall, because there are more of us who can speak on these challenges and come up with solutions together. And I hope my advice regarding the areas I felt confident enough to give it for was helpful in some way. If you have advice in any of these areas, I'd love to see it down in the comments. Consider bringing up some of these issues in your communities as well, because we need to talk about this. I'm confident that as our movements grow and mature, that we'll collectively be able to find solutions for at least some of these hurdles. We're stronger together after all. Special thanks to Fel, Wind in the World Tree and his mods, the wonderful mods at the bridge, and all the community members who chatted with me from the various servers when I was putting together the outline for this video. You all are wonderful, and it wouldn't exist without you. And of course, special thanks to my incredible and patient patrons. You all encouraged me to speak out, even though this topic likely will cause some controversy and discomfort, and reminded me that sometimes folks might not like to hear still need to be said. May the cycle of reciprocity between us ever remain positive. And remember, faith ain't fear.